The story of the kings and queens of England is more surprising than you might think. It's a fine drama, 1,000 years of tales of lust and betrayal, of heroism and cruelty, of mysteries, murders, tragedies, and triumphs. But there's more than that. This episode begins with a king of England who ruled for over a year, but who simply vanished from the record. And it ends with a boy whose claim to the throne was based on fictions that became historical orthodoxy. We begin in the year 1216, in the reign of King Louis of England. Yes, King Louis, not the most famous king of England. At the request of the barons and with the enthusiastic support of the population of London, he'd come to England from France to take over the crown from John. And John, struggling to fight back, had fallen ill and died. Louis, who'd been acclaimed king at a mass in St. Paul's Cathedral, now had the throne to himself. He had no coronation, as the bishops had been excommunicated, but rulers are created in England by acclamation, not coronation, which is why the uncrowned Edward VIII was a king, and Lady Jane Grey, who did have a coronation, was not queen. And Louis got rubbed out of the list of England's monarchs because his acclamation was, with hindsight, withdrawn. That was because the barons had not expected Louis to appoint his friends from France and Flanders as his chief councillors. They'd expected to be given much more control over what went on, and then they thought, there's a better option. John had a 9-year-old son, Henry. Of course, no child had ever been king, but there's a first time for everything, and if the king was a child and one of the barons was regent, then the barons really would be running things. Of course, Louis controlled London, but the child was at Corfe Castle, and they could at least get him to the nearest abbey, Gloucester, to crown him. Of course, they didn't have the crown, but they could use his mother's gold neckband. Actually, they didn't have an archbishop available to do the coronation. Never mind, the Bishop of Winchester was available and had the keys to the treasury. It wasn't a well-attended ceremony. Not even all of John's executors could get there, but it would have to do. Naturally, little Henry III was not actually exercising the powers of king. That was the job of a baron, the regent. The chap that got the job was a 70-year-old Earl of Pembroke, William Marshal, a safe pair of hands if ever there was one, Old Faithful. Marshal had long ago been a bold pole of advancement by the simple if very unusual principle of loyalty to his lord and total trustworthiness. Everyone trusted him, and now the barons expected him to get rid of Louis and rule on behalf of little Henry. And Louis was roundly defeated. In the end, he agreed to go back to France and agree he'd never been King of England at all. And all the barons and bishops who'd acclaimed him as king agreed that they'd never done anything of the sort. Everyone became patriotic. For the first time since the Norman conquest, the French were being described as foreigners, looting the English. The barons all spoke French, and they had nothing in common with the villeins on their lands, but they were beginning to feel English. And William Marshal reissued Magna Carta and said that all the old laws and rights of England were exactly what Henry III wanted to uphold. William Marshal died, the grand old hero of England, in 1219, and Henry was given a proper coronation at Westminster the following year. As Henry grew up, the barons and bishops had no intention of letting him get away from them. He learned to do as he was told, and that pretty much defined him as a king. What the barons and the bishops hadn't thought about was that one day he would be listening not to them, but to his wife. Perhaps one of them should have married him. Instead, in 1236, he married Eleanor, a younger daughter of the Count of Provence. He was 29, she was about 19, and she wrapped him round her finger. She arrived with her uncle, who immediately started running the king's life and carted huge amounts of treasure off to his homeland. Then she got another uncle installed as Archbishop of Canterbury. A physician became the Bishop of Durham, and large sums of money supposedly going to her mother were actually funding the wars of her brother-in-law, the Duke of Anjou. She was inevitably staggeringly unpopular. And however little money the king had, he always seemed able to support her relatives abroad, paying for their courts and their armies. In 1263, the population of London rose in rebellion. Their targets were Flemish bankers, Jewish financiers, and Queen Eleanor. She was in the Tower of London, London's royal palace, and got away from the Watergate to slip down the Thames to Windsor. As her boat approached London Bridge, she was pelted with missiles by a crowd shouting, "Drown the witch!" She managed to get back to the safety of the Tower. The kingdom had become ungovernable, at least by this king and queen. This was not the same country it had been in 1066. Towns had grown, trade had grown, London had grown. With the barons losing influence and Londoners angry, the crown itself was in danger. England was on the... A Frenchman on the make. The charming, clever younger son of a powerful and ruthless Norman lord. A chancer with style, Simon de Montfort. France was now ruled by King Louis's widow on behalf of their young son. She was a shrewd woman who decided that young Simon was dangerous stuff and forced him to escape abroad. He'd come to England in 1231, when he was about 23, intending to recover land his family had lost years ago. And he was really good at it. He became the best of friends with the impressionable Henry in no time, and Henry's sister fell for him. In 1238, they were married, and he was given back those lost family lands. He was Earl of Leicester. The English were suspicious of foreigners, so Simon completely converted into an Englishman. In 1239, Henry and Eleanor had a son. Simon sponsored the baptism. They chose the name Edward, after the great Anglo-Saxon king Edward the Confessor. This French royal family had adopted English patriotism. But as the political crisis deepened, Simon became increasingly committed to the total reform of government. Eventually, the crisis became a full-blooded civil war, and by the time the war ended in 1264, Henry and his son Edward were Simon's prisoners, and he took over the country. Simon now set about inventing an entirely new form of government, one which was based on the deeply rooted English principle of consent. In 1265, he summoned a meeting of the country, a parliament, at Westminster, to endorse his government. He summoned not only barons and bishops, but also 2 knights from each shire, and, most extraordinary, representatives from all the boroughs, the towns.
He said he was acting in the king's name, but the king didn't have much to do with what was going on. In fact, Simon had established what we might see as a modern state. There was a written constitution, a symbolic king, a powerful leading minister, and there was a parliament with representatives of the church, the countryside, represented by great landowners and gentry, and of towns. We might see it like that. They didn't. To most people at the time, this was clearly the tyranny of Simon de Montfort.
By now, Prince Edward was a grown man, 25 years old, and it was his job to overthrow this tyranny and restore the crown. First, of course, he had to escape imprisonment at Hereford Castle. The prince was allowed to exercise his horse on the common, so he wore out his guards' horses, racing with them, and then jumped onto a fresh horse that had been brought for the purpose and disappeared into the distance. What followed is into pieces. Henry was back on his throne, but it was Edward who was now running the country. This tall, muscular warrior, he was called Longshanks, had the military skill to crush the remaining rebels and the good sense not to punish them afterwards. He understood how to make peace and accepted the proposition that the king must respect legal limits on his power and consult with the nation. He also habitually spoke English, the first royal to do so since 1066. Parliament made him the steward of England. De Montfort's revolution had left its mark. The old king died in 1272, having reigned for 56 years. Edward's main interest in life was chivalry and warfare. His natural costume was armor. It had been since he was a child. When Henry died, Edward was out of the country on crusade. He came home to be crowned with his queen, yet another Eleanor, in 1273. The daughter of the King of Castile, she'd already borne Edward 6 children. They would have 10 more. England now had something like a settled system of government. Edward confirmed the existing charters, including Magna Carta, and was able to leave the business of government and justice to his council and judges. His main concern was how to gather the money to conduct his military interests without provoking more rebellions.
He hit on a brilliant policy. He invented nationalism. To demonstrate that his kingship was rooted in English tradition, he and Eleanor conducted the most remarkable ceremony at Glastonbury in 1278. In 90, the monks of Glastonbury had found graves which were believed to be those of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. The bones had been placed in the Lady Chapel. Now, 88 years later, King Edward carried the bones of Arthur and Queen Eleanor those of Guinevere. They put the legendary remains in a magnificent tomb in the main church.
Edward presented himself as a new Arthur. All this was part of a wider campaign to give his kingship the power of myth, and so unite the country behind him. This unity was going to be needed when he claimed supremacy over all Wales. It worked. When the Welsh princes rejected his claim, he was able to raise the money to make an enormous military effort. He became the first English king to totally conquer this mountainous territory. One of its princes, Llewellyn, was killed in battle. His head was mounted on the Tower of London. They were hanged, beheaded, and quartered. This was a savagery previously unknown in English law. The English system of shires and hundreds was now extended to cover all Wales, and the conquest was emphasized by huge state-of-the-art royal castles like this one at Carnarvon. Edward's war chest was based on a new source of royal finance. In 1275, Parliament granted him the right to charge customs duties on wool. See how useful it was having a parliament, with merchants to agree to taxes. Nevertheless, popular rhymes suggested trouble was brewing. The king he wants to get our gold, the queen would like our lands to hold. His war chest had come from Jewish moneylenders, but now they had no more to give. Never mind, the Jews could serve another purpose. Italian bankers would provide advances on the customs duties and collect the taxes themselves, and Edward could unite the country behind him in persecuting the Jews.
650 years later, the Third Reich would adopt his entire program. First, Edward decreed that they were a threat to the country. Their movements and activities were restricted. To identify them easily, all Jews were obliged to wear a yellow patch in the shape of a star.
Next, he arrested all the heads of Jewish households. Over 300 were taken to the Tower of London and executed, while others were murdered in their homes. Finally, in 1290, the king banished all Jews from the country. By now, the armored overlord was a national hero. When his wife, Queen Eleanor, died in the same year, worn out by childbirths, his own grief was turned into a major display of national mourning. Her body was ceremonially carried from Lincoln to Westminster, and a memorial cross erected at every one of the 12 resting places, including here at Charing in London. Charing Cross. It was time to enlarge the kingdom again. In 1296, he led an army to enforce his claim to Scotland. Edinburgh was seized, and the King of Scotland, stripped of his crown, was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Scottish kings were crowned enthroned on the Stone of Scone, or Stone of Destiny. Edward had it moved to London and put in the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey. Edward appointed a trio of Englishmen to run the country. Actually, his rule in Scotland was not noticeably harsh or unjust, but that was beside the point. His own conjuring of the demon of nationalism was turning against him. Ordinary Scots began to discover a feeling of national identity. A popular Scottish resistance movement grew, led by William. Most of Scotland had broken free before he was defeated. And then in 1306, rebellion began again, and Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scotland. By now, Edward, the Hammer of the Scots, was old and sick. He tried to lead an army back into Scotland, but it became obvious he'd never get there. A few miles north of Carlisle, on his deathbed, he gave instructions to his 23-year-old heir, Edward, Prince of Wales.
100 knights were to crusade, carrying his heart. The army should carry his bones to defeat Scotland, and the prince was not to have anything further to do with his very, very close friend Piers Gaveston. The king was dead. Edward II was ready to party.
Edward was physically tall and muscular, but his similarity to his father ended there. He had no interest in being a warlord. His father had taken him on campaign, but the prince travelled with a pet lion and a troop of Genoese fiddlers. Edward I had tried to change his character by assigning him a charismatic squire who was good at tournaments. This had backfired spectacularly. Edward and Piers Gaveston had fallen in love. Gaveston was banished, but obviously he was now coming back. Gaveston was an elegant, charming, artistic man who loved showing off his power over Edward and could still easily beat more macho men in tournaments. This was a recipe for a short life. Before his coronation, Edward married Isabella, the sister of the King of France. Then Gaveston was seen wearing Isabella's wedding jewellery. At the coronation, he showed up carrying the crown, wearing royal purple and pearls. Some of the barons wanted to kill him on the spot. Eventually, of course, they did kill him, here at Blacklow Hill in Warwickshire, having chased the king and Piers round the country. And then Robert Bruce, renegade King of Scotland, set about completing his War of Independence. He captured Edinburgh and besieged the last English stronghold, Stirling. In 1314, Edward II set out to relieve the city. The Battle of Bannockburn, just outside the castle, was a total disaster for the English. Edward's troubles were made worse by the fact that the climate, which had been benign for about 100 years, took a dramatic and long-term turn for the worse in 1315. As harvests failed and cattle died, the barons said that his extravagance and lack of direction was intolerable, so the grown-ups took over. The Earl of Lancaster, head of the council, was now acting as king, keeping Edward on a daily allowance of £10. Spencer was the only nobleman who had supported Gaveston. Eventually, they managed to help him break free of the power of Leicester and the other great nobles, but no one had a solution to the unending run of bad harvests, and the apparent enthusiasm of the dispensers to enrich themselves made Edward's rule deeply unpopular, especially with his queen Isabella. In 1325, she got away to France and refused to come home unless the dispensers were thrown out. Worse, she'd fallen passionately in love with an ally of Leicester's, who was hiding out in France, Roger Mortimer. Isabella and Mortimer gathered an army and invaded England in September 1326. As homophobia turned into mob rule, Isabella and Mortimer were joyously welcomed to London. In a few months it was all over. The elder dispenser, almost 90 years old, was hanged without being given time to take off his armour. The younger had his genitals cut off. Then he was disemboweled. The object was for Isabella and Mortimer to rule in the name of her 14-year-old son. But the boy refused to accept the crown without his father's consent. So Edward, dressed in black, was deposed in a solemn ceremony. The steward of his household broke his staff of office. He broke down and cried. He was eventually moved to Berkeley Castle, where he was encouraged to die as soon as possible. He was denied sufficient food and clothing, he was prevented from sleeping, he was crowned with a crown of hay and shaved with ditch water. Isabella, generally known as the she-wolf of France, reproved the guards for their mild treatment.
Since he would not die by himself, he was murdered in his bed on the 21st of September. It's said that he was raped with a red-hot poker. His dying shrieks were heard throughout the castle. Her homophobia had allowed Isabella and her lover Mortimer to brutally and illegally depose Edward II. That didn't make them heroes for long.
Edward III, in whose name they ruled, was their prisoner. But in 1320, when he was 18, he broke free. They were staying in Nottingham, and he put together a plot to lead a band of armed men into the castle through an underground passage. They seized Mortimer and Isabella. Mortimer was hanged. Isabella shut away in Castle Rising in Norfolk. And England had a king again. Law and proper government would be resumed under a handsome young man, properly entitled to the throne, who also happened to be a fine chivalrous knight who spoke English, French, and German, and who was already married with a baby son. What could be better than that? Extraordinary and significant military campaign since the Norman conquest. He announced that by the laws of inheritance, he was the rightful successor to the throne of France. It was rubbish. It wasn't. But he certainly meant to be. And in 1337, he began preparing his invasion. Actually, there were two genuine reasons for this, and neither had anything to do with the law of succession. One was that the French were supporting the Scots, and so long as that continued, the King of England would never be master of Scotland. And northern England would be constantly threatened by raiders, looters, and Scottish armies. The other was that England was now a busy commercial country selling wool to Flemish weavers. In 1336, Philip of France decided to take control of this trade. He arrested all English merchants in Flanders and took away the privileges of the Flemish towns and the craft guilds. English merchants pointed out that they'd lost their income. The king had lost his customs duties. The kingdom had lost its foreign trade. The coast on the far side of the Channel was vital to English security and prosperity. Whatever the cost, it must be kept open. The same imperative would force Britain to war against Napoleon, against the Kaiser, against Hitler. Edward was the first to have to face it. His solution was to claim France and break it. This little campaign is known to history as the 100 Years' War. This war actually changed the nature of the king's job, because it required a new kind of army. Ever since William the Conqueror, the idea had been that in exchange for their landholdings, lords and knights were supposed to turn up in arms and fight for the king when they were needed.
But this didn't work very well for a war overseas. Firstly, a knight's service was only meant to be for 40 days at a time. That doesn't work with a 100 Years' War. Secondly, many knights felt that they shouldn't be obliged to go overseas at all. They were probably right. And thirdly, they weren't necessarily fighting men anymore. So Edward needed to have a professional army.
Knights who didn't want to serve didn't have to. They could pay a tax called scutage that would allow Edward to hire professionals. Mercenaries were quick to see the opportunity for plunder and ransom and joined up. And freed from the need to pander to knightly good manners on the battlefield, Edward hired thousands of effective, deadly archers from the lower classes. Instead of being a feudal warlord, the king was now a professional commander. He invaded Normandy in 1346, and his professionals destroyed the old-fashioned feudal knights of France at Crécy, opening up that vital coast. Calais held out, and when native keys must be handed over by 6 leading burghers, barefoot, with nooses round their necks, to be hanged. When they arrived, the Queen publicly fell on her knees and pleaded for the burghers' lives, which of course Edward granted. This splendid pantomime was part of the theatre of royalty, which Edward was now developing to a magnificent art. The life of the king was being turned into a public performance. His court was the home of chivalry, and his lords and knights were given parts in the drama. It was a brilliant device for binding together war, taxation, and loyalty. The Queen was as important in this as the king. She led the ladies of the court, the judges of chivalric behavior, and she was the source of mercy, tempering her husband's justice. This was a religious image. People were encouraged to show devotion to the Virgin Mary, the Queen of Heaven, who would intercede and offer protection against divine judgment. Intercession was desperately needed by people who believed that God punished them with death. Death arrived at Weymouth in June 1348. Black Death. In less than a year, the whole country was stricken. No one could have understood what was happening. Once a person was infected, large, foul-smelling swellings developed in the groin, neck, and armpit. Death followed within 2 or 3 days. The disease killed more than a third of the population, and by 1350, the population of England was half that of 1315. In the midst of the dying, the theatre of royalty grew grander. Edward created the Order of the Garter, where two tournament teams played out an Arthurian drama based on St. George's Chapel at Windsor. The castle was rebuilt for the show. With the nobility bound to him by chivalric dreams, and the shires and towns granting funds for the war in Parliament, the French war could still go on. Another decisive victory at Poitiers in 1856 brought France to the point of disintegration. But by now, the war couldn't be ended. The nobility and troops saw endless vistas of plunder, while the king's only chance of income came not from his withered population, but from rich ransoms. This war would last 100 years. By the time Edward died in 1377, 65 years old, the townsmen and peasants of England were sick of the whole thing. The king's oldest son, Edward the Black Prince, had been the flower of chivalry and hugely popular, but he died a year before the king. The successor to the throne was the Black Prince's 10-year-old son, Richard. The war had by now turned against England. The French were ravaging the English coast. The shrunken working population demanded proper wages. They had no interest in performing feudal duties on the land, while desperate landowners needed more than ever to enforce them. Gaunt's government needed money and tried to raise it from a poll tax, not understanding that the population was far smaller than before. When they failed to raise the money they'd expected, they tried again, and England erupted. Lords, nobles, bishops, get rid of them all. Who needs them? When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The so-called Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was actually an uprising of the respectable people of towns and villages across England. Its aim, at least for the rebels that captured London, was an end to lordship in church and state. Just one archbishop and a king. Specifically not, they added, a king called John. They detested John of Gaunt, who went into hiding. The dramatic moment, of course, was the meeting of Richard and the rebels at Smithfield on the 14th of June. The rebel leader, Wat Tyler, was talking to the king when the mayor of London cut him down. The rebels immediately drew their bows, and the king, now 14 years old, rode forward to calm them.
I will be your captain. Come with me into the fields, and you shall have all you ask.
And they dispersed as he told them. It was an astonishing lesson in the mysterious power of kingship. The rebels should never have trusted him, of course. Once the danger was past, the ringleaders were hunted down and killed. Villains ye are, and villains ye shall remain. Years later, when Richard would need popular support, he would find he had none. But Richard had been given a dramatic vision of himself. He seems to have been convinced that the basis of his power lay in the special authority of sovereignty. He was the first English king to have portraits made. Instead of wars, he offered tournaments accompanied by music and dancing with the ladies of the court. But Richard's choice of companions were not the kind of men that most barons approved of. And above all, Richard abandoned the war with France, leaving France in control of Flanders.
Unpleasant references were made to Edward II, and look what happened to him. He found himself up against a group of noblemen who called themselves the Lords Appellants, which is what happened. Richard was effectively dethroned.
He was able to recover power in 1397. As part of his efforts to secure his throne, he exiled Henry Bolingbroke, John of Gaunt's son. But Bolingbroke came back with a vengeance, and Richard found that wherever he turned for support, it simply wasn't there. Bolingbroke captured him, demanded his voluntary abdication, and then sat on his throne. Richard disappeared into a prison in Pontefract Castle, where he was murdered. Richard had no children. The line of the Black Prince, Edward III's eldest son, had come to an end. The proper heir to the throne was an 8-year-old boy called Edmund, living in Ireland, the great-grandson of King Edward's second son. Henry's father was the third son, so Henry was certainly not heir to the throne. But he was a big man with a big red beard and a big army, and he was sitting right there in England on the throne, not in Ireland, not 8 years old, so Parliament decided that he was very definitely fully entitled to be King of England. Oh, yes! Edmund spent the whole of Bolingbroke's reign as a well-maintained prisoner. Henry was the first king to speak English as his native tongue. He was personable, brave, and a very capable leader in battle, but without legitimacy. He was clinging to power by his fingernails. Anyone who doubted Bolingbroke's right to be King of England could expect to be part-hanged and then have their intestines pulled out before being killed. His regime became ever more repressive as he became more worried. There was an uprising in the north which he put down with real ferocity. It was said that he personally killed 30 men in battle.
And the air hung heavy with the smoke of burning flesh as the English church, under this new regime, began burning heretics. The usurper needed to rule by fear, but the most frightened person in England was him, who'd seized the throne and killed King Richard, was a frightened man. He made himself sick with worry. Sometimes he sank into a coma. People said he had leprosy.
Government was taken over by his son, also called Henry, a young man who'd grown up fighting on his father's behalf. In fact, Parliament suggested that the king abdicate in his son's favour, which he refused to do. In 1413, the Grim Reaper came with a more convincing offer. He was only 45 years old, and the 26-year-old Henry V was crowned in April in a snowstorm. To get the country back onto a stable footing, he gave Richard II's remains a proper burial, and of course he got back to the important business of invading France.
France was still in a state of disintegration, ruled by Charles VI, a man with a severe mental disturbance. In a fit of derangement, he'd slaughtered his own attendants. Now he believed that he was made of glass and about to break. He actually had iron rods stitched into his clothing.
It was easy meat, and Henry's overwhelming victory at Agincourt in 1415 destroyed much of France's aristocracy. The English king was now in control of Paris. Charles, very fragile, agreed to acknowledge Henry as heir to the French throne. This meant disinheriting his own son, the Dauphin. And Henry took Charles's sister, Catherine de Valois, as his bride. What a great place to end the story. England safe, Edward III's plan to take over France brought to fruition, a genuinely popular king, and they all lived happily ever after. Not. In 1422, Henry V, not yet 35 years old, contracted dysentery and died. England had a new king, Henry and Catherine's son, Henry VI. 6 weeks later, the King of France also died, and Henry VI became King of France. Just one problem. His Majesty King Henry VI was only 10 months old. The Duke of Bedford was appointed Regent of France and the Duke of Gloucester Regent of England. And the baby's kingdoms, especially France, were in serious trouble. The Dauphin wanted his kingdom back, and everything the English had done, ravaging the countryside, destroying all authority and stability, could have been calculated to create a passionate nationalism. It was entirely natural for people to believe that Joan of Arc was on a divine mission to drive the English out of France and give it its rightful king. Under her inspirational leadership, the Dauphin's forces took over Orléans and Reims, and he was crowned King of France in Reims in 1429. Little Henry still not been crowned king of anything. Something obviously had to be done about that, so later the same year, now 7 years old, he had a coronation in Westminster Abbey. The idea was then to get him to Reims, where kings of France are supposed to be crowned. But that just wasn't safe, so he ended up being crowned King of France in Paris. It was all a mess. In fact, English forces were now fighting a losing battle. The new factor in the equation was gunpowder. Cannon and handguns changed the whole nature of warfare. And Henry was his job to lead the English forces in battle. They were finally destroyed at Castillon in 1453. The 100 Years' War was over. England was left with no possessions in France except Calais. But Henry's problems had barely begun. The taxes needed to fight the war and corruption among royal officials meant the country was disheartened and angry, and the issues of legitimacy that had lain pretty dormant in England since Henry Bolingbroke usurped the throne were now coming out of the woodwork. Richard II had been the last legitimate king of England, if there was such a thing. He'd been succeeded by his murderer, Henry Bolingbroke, the father of Henry V, the grandfather of Henry VI. They were all descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. But that wasn't the legitimate line of descent. John of Gaunt had an elder brother, whose descendants were still alive. The rightful King of England had not been Henry IV, but Edmund, the Earl of March. And now that Edmund was dead, it was his nephew, Richard, Duke of York. Edmund had carefully and probably wisely never made a point of making his claim. Henry IV and Henry V had been seriously powerful men, but Henry VI wasn't in the same league. His interest was not in war but in learning. He founded Eton and King's College, Cambridge, and he was a gentle, pious man. There were men who believed that he was more a saint than a king. Richard, Duke of York, now 40 years old, decided that it was time for the crown to fall into his hands. His claim was supported by most of the barons of southern England. The northern barons felt all this was codswallop. They had the right to choose their king, not be passed like slaves to whoever inherited them.
And then, quite suddenly, in the summer of 1453, the king went mad. He probably inherited the strain of madness in his mother's family, the illness that had racked Charles VI. The true legacy of Agincourt was not the crown of France, but a recurring disease that would afflict members of the English royal family for centuries.
He lost his memory, he lost control of his body, he lost the ability to speak coherently or understand what was said to him. His wife gave birth to their only son, but he knew nothing about it. With the king incapacitated, government needed to be handed to a regent, and the man with the backing in the south to take over the reins was Richard, Duke of York. The inevitable and disastrous outcome was civil war, Lancaster against York. Their badges, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, gave history the Wars of the Roses. To begin with, it was a war for control, not of the crown, but of the king. Richard didn't want to be crowned while Henry was still alive, nor the king made a partial recovery, but was quite incapable of taking charge of his defense. His queen made an impressive effort to do it for him. Margaret commanded in the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, when Richard of York was killed. Richard's son, Edward of York, had none of his father's qualms about taking the crown. In March 1461, Edward, without any parliamentary approval, had himself crowned Edward IV. Henry was still alive, a husk, and became a refugee with his queen. The deposed royal family hid in Scotland. Then Henry was captured and became a prisoner in London. In 1470, an extraordinary upheaval backed by the King of France drove Edward IV from London, and Henry was rescued from prison and restored to his throne. It's said that while Edward plotted his return from exile in Holland, Henry had a curious interview with one of his distant relatives, a boy of 14, Henry Tudor. After the death of his father, Henry VI's mother, Catherine de Valois, had an affair with one of her servants, a Welshman, Owen ap Maredudd ap Tudor. It was probably King Henry who arranged the marriage of their son Edmund Tudor to Margaret Beaufort, a great-grandchild of John of Gaunt. Margaret became pregnant immediately.
But the Beaufort family were disbarred by ancient royal charters from ever succeeding to the throne. So why did she call her baby Henry? No Beaufort had ever been called Henry. No Tudor had ever been called Henry. It was a king's name. It suggests that Owen had great plans for the boy, and that was obviously what Edward of York thought. As soon as he had Owen Tudor in his power in 1461, he had his head chopped off.
His head was displayed lit up with 100 candles. Henry Tudor, aged 4, had been taken prisoner, but now young Tudor was free, and according to later stories was looked on as an important figure in the line of succession. According to Shakespeare, Henry VI looked at the boy and said, "Lo, surely this is he to whom both we and our adversaries shall hereafter give place." The following year, Edward IV made his counter-strike. King Henry's son was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury, and Henry VI himself was captured. A few days later, he was murdered in the Tower of London. The Wars of the Roses were over, the competition between England's barons for nobles having been slaughtered. Henry Tudor was now head of the House of Lancaster. He had no claim to the throne, of course, coming from the debarred Beaufort family, so Edward should not have regarded him as a threat, in theory.
Just to be on the safe side, he fled to Brittany. But Henry Tudor would be back, and he would make sure he controlled how the story was written. In the next program, we'll see how Henry Tudor shaped our knowledge of what followed, creating the story of the most evil king in history and setting the stage for the most heroic queen.
How much do you know about Henry V? Sky Digital viewers, press red and take our test. The turbulent reigns of the Tudors tonight at 10. Coming up next, protecting US bombers from German attack, the P-51 Mustang, decisive weapon.
They were beginning to feel English. And William Marshall reissued Magna Carta and said that all the old laws and rights of England were exactly what Henry III wanted to uphold. William Marshall died, the grand old hero of England, in 1219, and Henry was given a proper coronation at Westminster the following year. As Henry grew up, the barons and bishops had no intention of letting him get away from them. He learned to do as he was told, and that pretty much defined him as a king.
What the barons and the bishops hadn't thought about was that one day he would be listening not to them, but to his wife. Perhaps one of them should have married him. Instead, in 1236, he married Eleanor, a younger daughter of the Count of Provence. He was 29, she was about 19, and she wrapped him round her finger.
She arrived with her uncle, who immediately started running the king's life and carted huge amounts of treasure off to his homeland.